Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight, we're drifting into the mist-shrouded waters where a lone fisherman encounters the ghost fleet of the Heike clan and discovers something unimaginable. So, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now, let's dive into tonight's story together. The sea remembers everything. It holds the weight of 1,000 years beneath its surface, cradling the bones of warriors and emperors alike in its cold embrace. Along the shores of the Shimonoseki Strait, where the waters run dark and deep, fishermen speak in hushed tones of vessels that drift through the fog on moonless nights. They speak of ships with tattered sails and hulls worn by centuries of salt and sorrow. They speak of the Heike, the fallen clan whose spirits have wandered these waters since the spring of 1185, when the tide turned red with their blood and the sea swallowed their dreams of glory. This is a story of one such encounter, a story of a lone sailor who ventured too far into the mist and found himself face to face with the ghosts of a war that never truly ended. The wind had died hours ago, leaving the small fishing boat adrift in a silence so complete it felt like drowning. Takeshi sat motionless in the stern, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the wall of fog that surrounded him on all sides. The mist had rolled in from the north as the sun began its descent, thick and gray as ash, swallowing the horizon until there was nothing left but the slow rocking of his boat and the soft lapping of water against wood. He had fished these waters all his life, as had his father and his father before him, but he had never seen fog like this. It seemed to press against his skin, heavy and cold, carrying with it the faint smell of iron and salt. The old man who had taught him to read the tides had once told him stories about the Heike, about the great clan that had ruled Japan before they fell to the sword in the sea, about how their spirits still haunted the strait, where they had made their final stand, searching for the young emperor they had failed to protect. Takeshi had listened to those stories as a boy, sitting by the fire in his master's small hut, watching the flames cast shadows on the walls. He had thought them nothing more than tales meant to frighten children and keep them from venturing too far from shore. But now, as the fog wrapped around him like a funeral shroud, he found himself remembering every word. The sound came without warning, a low creaking, like the groan of old timber under strain, echoing through the mist. Takeshi's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, scanning the gray wall that surrounded him, but he could see nothing beyond a few feet of dark water. The creaking came again, closer this time, accompanied by the faint splash of oars cutting through the sea. His heart began to beat faster. There should be no other boats out here. The fishing fleet had returned to port hours ago, driven back by the encroaching fog and the promise of a storm. He was alone. He had to be alone. But the sound grew louder, the rhythmic splash of oars, the creak of wood, and now something else. Voices, faint and distant, carried on wind that did not exist, speaking words he could not quite make out. Takeshi's hands moved to the small shrine he kept at the bow of his boat, his fingers brushing against the worn wood. He whispered a prayer to the kami of the sea, asking for protection, asking for guidance, asking to be delivered safely home. The voices continued, rising and falling like a song sung in a language he had forgotten. Then, through the fog, he saw it. A shadow at first, dark and shapeless, moving with the slow inevitability of a nightmare. It resolved itself gradually, taking form as it drew closer. A ship, not like his small fishing vessel, but a great warship of ancient design, its hull rising from the water like the back of some terrible beast. The wood was blackened and worn, eaten away by centuries beneath the waves, yet somehow it still floated. Tattered banners hung from its mast, red cloth faded to the color of dried blood, bearing symbols he did not recognize. And on its deck, moving with slow, deliberate purpose, were figures. Men in armor that gleamed wetly in the dim light, their movements stiff and strange, as if they had forgotten how the living moved. Takeshi could not move. He could not speak. He could only watch as the ghost ship drifted past him, silent now except for the creak of its ancient timbers. The warriors on its deck did not turn to look at him. They stared straight ahead, their faces hidden beneath helmets that dripped with seawater, their hands gripping weapons that looked ready to strike. At the stern stood a figure smaller than the rest, a child wrapped in robes of silk that clung to his small frame. Even from this distance, Takeshi could see the weight of the crown upon his head, too heavy for such young shoulders. The child emperor, Antoku, lost to the sea 800 years ago. The ship continued its slow journey through the fog, and Takeshi found he could not look away. His eyes traced the line of the hull, the curve of the sail, the faces of the dead who manned it. They were searching for something. He could feel it in the air, in the way the fog seemed to follow in their wake, in the hollow emptiness that pressed against his chest. They were searching, and they would never stop searching, not until the sea itself dried up and the world ended. Because some debts could not be paid, some failures could not be undone, and some ghosts would never find peace. As the ship began to fade back into the mist, Takeshi felt something shift inside him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air, a certainty that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet understand. He sat alone in his small boat, surrounded by fog and silence, and wondered if he had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Takeshi had been born in a small village that clung to the rocky coast of the Shimonoseki Strait, like a barnacle to a ship's hull. It was a place of gray stones and grayer skies, where the houses huddled together against the wind, and the temple bell rang out across the water each morning to mark the beginning of another day. His father had been a fisherman, and his grandfather before him, and when Takeshi was old enough to hold an oar, he too had taken to the sea. There was no other choice. The land was hard and unyielding, giving up little to those who tried to farm it. But the sea, for all its dangers, had always provided. He had learned the rhythms of the tide, the patterns of the fish, the way the wind changed before a storm. He had learned to read the water like other men read scrolls, seeing in its surface the story of what lay beneath. His hands had grown hard from pulling nets and mending lines. His skin had darkened from long hours under the sun, and his heart had grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with a life spent more on water than on land. He had married once, many years ago, a girl from the next village who had smiled at him during a festival. They had been happy, or as happy as people could be when survival took all their strength. But she had died giving birth to their first child, and the child had followed her 3 days later. After that, Takeshi had buried himself in his work, rising before dawn and returning long after dark, speaking to no one unless he had to. The other fishermen thought him strange. They did not understand his need for solitude, his preference for fishing alone rather than joining the fleet. They whispered that the grief had broken something inside him, that he had spent too much time staring at the water and not enough time among the living. Perhaps they were right, but Takeshi did not care. The sea did not judge him. It did not ask questions or offer unwanted sympathy. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and that was enough. On the morning of the day the fog came, he had woken before dawn as always. His small house stood at the edge of the village, close enough to hear the temple bell, but far enough that he did not have to see his neighbors unless he wanted to. He had eaten a simple meal of rice and pickled vegetables, then gathered his nets and made his way down to the shore. His boat waited for him where he had left it, tied to a post driven deep into the sand. It was not a large vessel, barely big enough for one man and his catch, but it was sturdy and well maintained. He had built it himself, using techniques passed down through his family, and it had served him faithfully for many years. The sky had been clear when he set out, the stars still visible overhead, slowly fading as the first light touched the eastern horizon. The water was calm, reflecting the deep blue of the coming dawn, and Takeshi had felt a rare moment of peace as he pushed away from shore. He had rowed out to his usual fishing grounds, a place where the current ran strong and the fish were plentiful, and had cast his nets. The morning had passed in quiet work, the sun rising higher, warming his back as he pulled in his catch and sorted through it. It had been a good day. The nets were full, and the fish were large and healthy. He had allowed himself to think that perhaps fortune was finally turning in his favor. But as the afternoon wore on, he had noticed the change. The wind had shifted, coming now from the north, carrying with it a chill that had not been there before. The sky had darkened, clouds gathering on the horizon, and the water had taken on a strange, flat quality, as if it were holding its breath. Takeshi had seen storms before. He knew the signs, but this felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. He had decided to head back to shore, to return to the safety of the village before whatever was coming arrived. But the fog had found him first. It had rolled in faster than he had thought possible, swallowing the sky and the sea in a matter of minutes. One moment, he could see the distant outline of the coast. The next, there was nothing but gray. He had tried to orient himself by the current, using the feel of the water to guide him, but the current had changed. It pulled in directions that made no sense, twisting and turning as if the sea itself had lost its way. His boat had drifted, caught in the grip of something he could not see or understand, and he had found himself stranded in that terrible stillness. That was when he had heard the sound, the creaking of wood, the splash of oars, the voices of the dead, and he had known, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the old stories were true. The Heike had not found peace. They were still here, wandering the waters where they had fallen, bound by chains stronger than any anchor. And somehow, in his drift through the fog, he had stumbled into their realm. The ghost ship disappeared into the mist, leaving Takeshi alone once more. But the silence that returned was different now. It was not the peaceful quiet of an empty sea, but the suffocating stillness of a held breath. The fog pressed closer, thicker than before, and the air felt heavy with moisture and something else. Something that made his skin prickle and his breath come short. He sat in his boat, his hands gripping the sides until his knuckles turned white, and tried to understand what he had just seen. It should have been impossible. Ships did not sail with crews of the dead. Emperors drowned centuries ago did not stand on weathered decks, staring into nothing. But he had seen it. He had seen it as clearly as he saw the wood beneath his hands, the water around his boat, the fog that surrounded him. And deep in his heart, beneath the fear and the disbelief, he knew that he had been chosen, not by chance, but by something older and more deliberate. The sea had brought him here for a reason. The ghosts had shown themselves to him for a purpose, and though every instinct screamed at him to flee, to row as hard as he could toward any shore, he found he could not move. The voices came again, drifting through the fog like smoke. They were clearer now, distinct enough that he could make out individual words, though the language was old and formal, filled with phrases he barely recognized. They spoke of duty and honor, of a young emperor who had deserved better than the fate dealt to him, of a battle lost not through lack of courage, but through the cruel turn of the tide. And beneath it all, woven through every word, like a thread of black silk, was a grief so deep it seemed to have no bottom. Takeshi closed his eyes and listened. He listened to the warriors recounting their final moments, the way the arrows had darkened the sky, the way their ships had burned and sank, the way the water had closed over their heads as they chose death over dishonor. He listened to the women who had followed them into the depths, unable to bear the thought of capture, clutching their children to their breasts as they stepped over the rails. And he listened to the child emperor, whose voice was small and lost, asking why no one had saved him, why the gods had turned their faces away, why he had to die when all he wanted was to live. The pain of it was unbearable. Takeshi felt tears on his cheeks, hot against his cold skin, and he did not try to stop them. How could anyone hear such sorrow and not weep? How could anyone witness the weight of such loss and remain unmoved? The Heike had been more than warriors. They had been fathers and sons, brothers and husbands, people with dreams and fears and hopes for tomorrow, and all of it had been taken from them in a single afternoon, washed away in a tide of blood and salt water. No wonder their spirits could not rest. No wonder they wandered still, searching for something that could never be found. Time passed in strange ways in that place. Takeshi could not have said if hours went by or only minutes. The fog seemed to exist outside the normal flow of things, a pocket of forever caught between one breath and the next. He became aware gradually of other ships appearing around him, emerging from the gray like fragments of a half-remembered dream. They came in all sizes and shapes, from great warships to smaller vessels, meant for carrying supplies. All of them bore the same marks of decay, the same tattered banners, the same crews of silent, searching ghosts. They moved in a slow procession, circling through the fog in patterns that might have meant something once, but now were only habit, repeated endlessly because there was nothing else to do. On some of the ships, Takeshi could see the marks of battle, hulls split open by rams, masts broken and hanging at strange angles, decks stained dark with blood that would never wash away. On others, the damage was less obvious, but he could see it in the faces of those who stood at the rails. Faces twisted with fear or pain, mouths open in silent screams, eyes that stared at nothing and everything at once. These were the ones who had drowned, he realized. The ones who had jumped or been pushed, who had sunk beneath the waves with armor weighing them down, who had struggled for air that would not come. They had died in terror, and that terror remained, frozen on their features like ice that would never melt. But the worst were the children. There were more of them than Takeshi had expected. Small figures in fine robes standing alone or held in the arms of women whose faces were blank with shock. They did not move or speak. They simply stood, waiting for something that would never arrive, their young lives cut short before they had truly begun. Looking at them, Takeshi felt something break inside him. His own child had died before taking even a single breath, before opening its eyes to see the world. He had buried that tiny body beneath a cherry tree behind the temple and had not allowed himself to grieve properly, fearing that if he started, he would never stop. But now, seeing these lost children of the Heike, he could not hold it back any longer. He wept for them all, for the warriors who had fought with courage and died with honor, for the women who had chosen death over dishonor, for the emperor who had been too young to understand why his life was ending, for his own child who he had never known, for his wife who had suffered and died bringing that child into the world, for every lost soul who had ever been taken before their time, who had ever drowned in water or sorrow or the simple, terrible unfairness of existence. He wept until his body shook and his throat was raw, until there were no more tears left inside him, only a hollow ache where his heart should be. And as he wept, the ghosts drew closer. Their ships formed a ring around his small boat, pressing in until he was surrounded on all sides by weathered wood and watching eyes. But they did not threaten him. They did not reach out to drag him down into the depths as the old stories said they might. They simply watched, bearing witness to his grief as he had borne witness to theirs. And in that shared moment of sorrow, something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition that pain was pain, whether it came from a battle lost 800 years ago or from a death that happened yesterday. Suffering did not have a hierarchy. Loss was loss, and the dead knew this better than anyone. The fog began to change. It grew thicker in some places, thinner in others, and through the gaps, Takeshi caught glimpses of something vast and terrible taking shape. The water around him started to churn, waves rising and falling in patterns that matched no natural current. The ghost ships began to move with more purpose, their crews taking up positions as if preparing for something. And then, like thunder rolling across the sky, he heard it, the sound of battle. War drums pounding out a rhythm that made his heart race, conch shells blowing signals across the water, the clash of metal on metal, the thunk of arrows hitting wood, the cries of men fighting and dying. The fog parted, and Takeshi saw the past laid out before him like a scroll unrolling. The strait was filled with ships, hundreds of them, their sails bright with clan colors that had not flown in centuries. On one side, the red banners of the Taira, the Heike clan, proud and desperate in their final stand. On the other, the white banners of the Minamoto, the Genji, pressing their advantage with the ruthlessness of those who knew victory was within reach. Between them, the water churned with the passage of vessels moving to attack or defend, oars beating the surface to foam, bows loosing arrows in volleys that darkened the sky. It was the Battle of Dan no-ura, the final confrontation that had ended the Genpei War and sealed the fate of the Heike. Takeshi had heard the story many times, but hearing and seeing were different things. To witness it now, even as a phantom echo, was to understand the magnitude of what had been lost. This was not just a battle. It was the death of an age, the end of a dynasty, the moment when the world tilted on its axis and everything changed. And he was watching it happen, frozen in time, repeated endlessly in this realm where the dead could not let go. At first, the Heike seemed to have the advantage. The morning tide had been with them, and their ships moved swiftly through the strait, their warriors fighting with the desperate courage of those who knew they had nothing left to lose. Takeshi saw individual acts of heroism that should have been celebrated in song. A warrior leaping from one ship to another to engage 3 opponents at once. An archer shooting down enemy arrows in mid-flight, protecting his commander. A young samurai, barely more than a boy, standing firm at the prow of a burning ship until the flames consumed him. But as the day wore on, the tide turned, literally and figuratively. The current that had aided the Heike reversed, flowing now in favor of the Minamoto, and the red-bannered ships found themselves pushed back, struggling to maintain position. Worse, the Minamoto had learned which ship carried the Emperor. The child Antoku, only 7 years old, dressed in robes too fine for battle, stood at the center of a protective circle of warriors who knew they were all doomed. The enemy arrows focused on that ship with single-minded intensity, cutting down the defenders one by one, each loss making the circle smaller, bringing the threat closer to the innocent boy at its center. Takeshi watched as a woman emerged from below deck. She was older, her face lined but beautiful, her bearing regal despite the chaos around her. The Emperor's grandmother. She moved with calm determination through the carnage, picking her way over fallen bodies until she reached the child. She knelt beside him, speaking words Takeshi could not hear, but could imagine. Words of comfort, words of apology, words meant to ease the fear of a boy who did not understand why this was happening. Then she lifted him into her arms, holding him close, and walked to the rail. The battle seemed to pause. Warriors on both sides turned to look, their weapons frozen mid-swing, their voices dying in their throats. They knew what was about to happen. They knew, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The woman looked out at the water, dark and deep and waiting. She looked back at the ship, at the warriors who had failed to protect their emperor, at the enemy closing in from all sides. And then, with a grace that seemed impossible in such a moment, she stepped over the rail and fell. The splash was small, barely visible among the larger waves, but it echoed through Takeshi's chest like a drum. He felt the cold water closing over them, felt the weight of the child's small body in her arms, felt the moment when they stopped struggling and let the sea take them. All around the ship, others followed. Warriors who could not bear to live with their failure, nobles who chose death over capture, women who saw no future in a world ruled by their enemies. They stepped over the rails one by one, or in pairs, or in small groups, sinking beneath the surface until the water was filled with bodies and the sea itself seemed to weep. But some fought on. Taira no Tomomori, one of the great commanders of the Heike, refused to surrender even as his ship sank around him. Takeshi saw him standing at the stern, his armor torn and bloody, his sword still in his hand. He looked out at the carnage, at the floating bodies, at the red water, and his face was a mask of such profound sorrow that Takeshi had to look away. Then Tomomori took up a ship's anchor, a massive piece of iron meant to hold a vessel steady, and tied it around his waist. He spoke a final prayer, though the words were lost in the din of battle, and threw himself into the sea. The anchor dragged him down quickly, and he did not fight it. He simply let himself sink, choosing to join his emperor in death, rather than live with the shame of defeat. The battle ended not with a final clash, but with a slow fading. The Minamoto ships closed in on the few remaining Heike vessels, and the fighting became sporadic, then stopped altogether. The survivors were pulled from the water or captured on their ships, and the strait grew quiet, except for the groaning of damaged wood and the cries of the wounded. The Heike were gone. Their power was broken, their clan scattered, their emperor dead. And the waters of Dan no Ura had claimed them, holding them beneath the surface where they would remain, unable to rise, unable to rest, for centuries to come. As the vision faded, the ghost ships around Takeshi returned to their aimless drifting. The fog closed in again, hiding the past behind its gray veil, but the weight of what he had seen remained. He understood now why the Heike could not move on. They were trapped, not just by their deaths, but by their failure. They had been entrusted with the protection of their emperor, a sacred child who represented the divine will, and they had failed. That failure had stained their souls, binding them to this place, forcing them to relive their final moments over and over in the hope that somehow, impossibly, the outcome might change. But it never did. It never would. And so they wandered, caught in an eternal loop of duty and despair. Takeshi felt a presence beside his boat. He turned slowly, his body stiff with cold and exhaustion, and saw a figure standing on the water itself. It was not walking, but simply existing there, as solid as if it stood on land. The figure was a warrior, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in armor that bore the scars of countless battles. The helmet was gone, revealing a face that was both young and ancient, handsome and terrible. This was Tomomori, the commander who had tied an anchor to his waist and chosen the depths over dishonor. His eyes, dark and fathomless, looked directly at Takeshi, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. When the ghost spoke, his voice was like wind through hollow reeds, soft but carrying across the water with perfect clarity. He spoke of regret, of choices made in the heat of battle that had seemed right at the time but had led only to ruin, of a young emperor who had trusted him, who had looked at him with eyes that believed he could protect them from anything, and how that trust had been betrayed, not through lack of courage, but simply through bad fortune and the turning of the tide. He spoke of sinking into the dark water, the anchor pulling him down, and how in those final moments he had felt not fear, but relief. At least it was over. At least the fighting was done. But that relief had been an illusion. Death had brought no peace. It had only changed the nature of his prison. Takeshi listened without interrupting. What could he say to a ghost who had carried such burden for 800 years? What words of comfort existed that had not already been spoken by others, by priests and monks, and the countless people who had offered prayers at the temples built to honor the fallen Heike? But as Tomomori continued, Takeshi realized that the ghost was not looking for comfort. He was looking for something else: understanding, acknowledgement, a witness who would carry the truth of what had happened here, who would remember not just the battle, but the people who had fought it. The Heike had been turned into legends, their story told and retold until it had hardened into myth. But myths were not the same as truth. Myths were clean and simple, with clear heroes and villains. Truth was messy and complicated, and full of people who were both at once. The ghost finished speaking and stood in silence, waiting. Takeshi understood that a response was required, that this was not just a haunting, but a conversation, a connection between the living and the dead that happened rarely and was not to be wasted. He thought carefully about what to say, how to honor the weight of what had been shared with him. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. He told Tomomori that he had seen, that he understood the burden of failure, of losing something precious that could never be recovered, that he knew what it meant to live with regret, to wonder if different choices might have led to different outcomes, and that he would remember, not the legend of the Heike, but the truth of them, the warriors who had fought with courage, the emperor who had been too young, the choices made in impossible circumstances that had led to tragedy. For just a moment, something shifted in Tomomori's eyes. Not peace, but perhaps a lessening of the weight he carried, an acknowledgement that he had been heard and understood, that his story had been witnessed by someone who would not turn it into a simple tale of victory and defeat. Then the ghost bowed, a deep formal gesture of respect, and stepped backward into the fog. He did not disappear immediately, but faded slowly, like ink spreading through water, until there was nothing left but the gray and the silence. Takeshi sat alone once more, but he did not feel alone. The presence of the Heike surrounded him still, invisible but undeniable, and he knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this was not over. The ghosts had shown him their past. Now they would show him their present, and perhaps, if he was strong enough, their future. The night deepened around Takeshi, though it was impossible to tell time in that place where the fog had swallowed the sky. The ghost ships continued their endless patrol, their crews going through the motions of duty they could not abandon. But now Takeshi was aware of other things. Lights that flickered in the distance, pale and cold, moving with the slow drift of things that had drowned and risen again. Sounds that were not quite voices, not quite music, but something in between. The sea itself seemed different, heavier somehow, as if it were saturated with the weight of all the deaths it had witnessed, all the sorrows it had absorbed. He tried to row, to move his boat in some direction that might lead him out of this realm and back to the world of the living. But his oars found no purchase. The water seemed to resist his efforts, pushing back each time he tried to pull forward, keeping him suspended in this in-between place. It was not violent or aggressive. It simply was, patient and immovable as stone. The sea had claimed him, at least for now, and it would release him only when it chose. So he waited. He pulled his thin jacket tighter against the cold and settled into the bottom of his boat, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of change. The temperature continued to drop, and he could see his breath misting in the air before him. His hands were numb, his feet aching, but he barely noticed. Physical discomfort seemed less important here, overshadowed by the vastness of what he was experiencing. He was alive in a realm of the dead, a witness to something that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. Fear had given way to something else, not quite acceptance, but a recognition that resistance was futile, and that his only choice was to be present, to observe, to try to understand. The lights grew brighter as they approached. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, floating just above the surface of the water, or sometimes beneath it, glowing with a sickly greenish hue. The fishermen called them onabi, demon fires, and said they were the souls of the drowned trying to lead the living to the same fate. But looking at them now, Takeshi saw no malice. They simply existed, wandering through the fog, occasionally clustering together before drifting apart again. Some were brighter than others, pulsing with an intensity that suggested strong emotion. Others were dim and flickering, as if the spirit animating them had grown weak over the centuries. One of the lights drifted close to his boat, hovering just beyond arm's reach. As it came nearer, Takeshi could make out a shape within the glow, a face, not solid or fully formed, but present enough that he could see features. It was a woman, young and beautiful, her eyes closed as if in sleep. Her lips moved silently, forming words he could not hear. A prayer, perhaps, or a lullaby, or simply the repetition of a name. As he watched, her eyes opened, and they were filled with such profound sadness that he felt his throat tighten. She looked at him, and in that look was a question. Why? Why did this happen? Why was I not saved? Why does it continue? Takeshi had no answer. He could only look back at her, meeting her gaze, acknowledging her pain. After a long moment, the woman's face softened slightly, and she began to fade back into the light. But before she disappeared completely, she raised one translucent hand and pointed out into the fog, toward something Takeshi could not yet see. Then she was gone, and the light drifted away, joining the others in their eternal wandering. He looked in the direction she had pointed and saw a new shape forming in the mist. Not a ship this time, but a structure. A building rising from the water where no building should be. As he watched, it became clearer, resolving into the shape of a temple. The roof curved upward in the traditional style, its tiles green with age and algae, its wooden pillars thick and weathered. Lanterns hung from the eaves, unlit but swaying gently as if moved by wind. And at the entrance, standing in the open doorway, was the figure of a monk. The monk was old, his head shaved, his robes simple and worn. He stood with his hands clasped before him, his expression calm and patient. Unlike the other ghosts Takeshi had seen, this one seemed less bound by sorrow. There was stillness about him, a sense of acceptance that suggested he had made peace with whatever had brought him to this place. He gestured to Takeshi, a simple movement of one hand, inviting him forward. Takeshi found himself rowing without conscious thought, his oars finally finding purchase in the water, pulling him toward the temple. As he drew closer, he could see that the building was partially submerged, its lower half disappearing into the dark water, its foundations lost to the depths. But the upper portion remained intact, and the monk stood just above the waterline, waiting. When Takeshi's boat bumped gently against the temple steps, the monk spoke. His voice was different from Tomomori's, less heavy with grief, more contemplative. He introduced himself as a priest who had died trying to save the young emperor, who had jumped into the water after the child and his grandmother, hoping to pull them back, to give them one more chance at life. But the water had been too cold, the currents too strong, and he had drowned alongside those he had tried to save. His body had washed ashore days later and been given proper burial. His spirit, however, had returned to the strait, drawn back by the same force that held the Heike. He had built this temple in the realm of ghosts, a place where the wandering souls could come to pray, to seek guidance, to find what small comfort existed in their eternal exile. The monk invited Takeshi inside, and though every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that he should not enter a building that existed only in the world of the dead, he found himself climbing out of his boat and stepping onto the submerged stairs. The stone was solid beneath his feet, cold and slick with algae, but it held his weight. He climbed slowly, one step at a time, until he reached the doorway where the monk waited. Up close, he could see that the old man's eyes were kind, but infinitely sad, eyes that had witnessed too much suffering and could never look away. Inside, the temple was both more and less than he expected. The main hall was large and empty, its wooden floor warped from water damage, its walls bare except for a single scroll hanging at the far end. The scroll bore calligraphy in a style so ancient, Takeshi could barely read it, but he made out enough to understand the message. It was a sutra, a Buddhist teaching about the impermanence of all things, about how attachment to the world leads to suffering, and how true peace comes only from letting go. The irony was not lost on him. Here were spirits who could not let go, trapped by their attachments, reading prayers about detachment in a temple that should not exist. The monk led him to the center of the hall and invited him to sit. Takeshi lowered himself to the floor, his wet clothes clinging to his skin, his body shaking from cold and exhaustion. The monk sat across from him, settling into a meditation posture with practiced ease, and for a long time Neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt natural, necessary, a pause between one breath and the next that allowed for reflection. When the monk finally spoke again, it was about choice, about how the living always had choices, even when they seemed not to, about how the dead had given up that privilege, fixing themselves in a single moment, unable to move forward or back. The Heike could not choose peace because they had not chosen it in life. They had chosen duty, chosen honor, chosen loyalty to their clan and their emperor, and those choices had become chains binding them to this place. Not because the choices were wrong, but because they had held on to them so tightly that even death could not pry them loose. But Takeshi was alive. He still had choices, and the choice before him now was whether to carry the story of the Heike back to the world of the living, to remember them as they truly were, or to let them fade into legend and myth. The monk explained that memory was the only real power the dead possessed. As long as they were remembered, truly remembered, they existed in some small way. But when memory faded, when the details were lost, and the story became just another tale told around fires, they became less than ghosts. They became nothing. The monk paused, then asked a question that seemed to echo through the empty hall. What did Takeshi choose? Would he be a witness? Would he carry their names and their stories back to the living world? Would he ensure that the Heike were remembered not as villains, or even as tragic heroes, but as people who had lived and loved and fought and died, who had been caught up in forces larger than themselves and had done the best they could with the choices they had? Takeshi thought about his own life, about the wife and child he had lost, whose names he spoke only in the quietest hours of the night, whose faces had begun to fade from his memory, despite his efforts to hold on to them. He thought about how desperately he wanted them to be remembered, to be more than just another pair of deaths in a world full of death. And he thought about the Heike, about the warriors and the women and the children, about the young emperor and his grandmother, about all the souls trapped in this fog-bound realm. And he knew there was only one answer he could give. Yes, he would remember. He would carry their story back to the world of the living. He would tell anyone who would listen about what he had seen, about the truth beneath the legend. And when he died, whenever that might be, he would carry that memory with him into whatever came after, ensuring that some small part of the Heike continued to exist as long as he did. The monk smiled for the first time since Takeshi had arrived. It was a sad smile, but genuine, and it transformed his ancient face. He nodded once, a gesture of gratitude and respect, and then rose to his feet. He led Takeshi back to the doorway, back to the edge where the temple met the water, and pointed out into the fog. "The path is there," he said. "Follow it, and you will find your way home. But remember your promise. Remember us. Speak our names. Tell our story. Do not let us fade into nothing." Takeshi bowed deeply, a bow that conveyed all the gratitude and respect he felt, but could not put into words. Then he climbed down the slick stairs, back into his small boat, and pushed away from the temple. As he rowed, he looked back once and saw the monk still standing in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell. The temple began to fade back into the fog, its outline growing less distinct until it was gone entirely, and there was nothing behind him but gray. The fog began to thin, not quickly, but gradually, like a curtain being pulled back inch by inch. Takeshi could see farther now, could make out the shapes of waves and the faint line where water met sky. The ghost ships were gone. Their crews returned to whatever realm they inhabited when they were not haunting the strait. The lights had vanished. The sounds of battle had faded. He was alone again, truly alone, in a normal sea under a normal sky, and the relief he felt was so intense it made him dizzy. But the cold remained. It had seeped into his bones during his time in that other place, and no amount of rowing seemed able to warm him. His hands were clumsy on the oars, his movements slow and uncoordinated. His teeth chattered, and his breath came in short, painful gasps. He knew he needed to find land soon, needed to get somewhere warm and dry, or his body would simply give up. The current had changed again, and this time it was pulling him in a direction that felt right. He let it guide him, rowing when he had the strength, drifting when he did not. Time passed strangely still, though nothing like the eternal suspension of the fog. The sun was rising, or perhaps it had never set, and he had simply lost track of time. The light was thin and gray, but it was real light, coming from a real sun, and Takeshi had never been more grateful for anything in his life. He saw land in the distance, a rocky shore that he recognized, though he was many miles from where he had started. The current had carried him south along the coast, past villages and harbors he knew by name, until he found himself approaching a small cove he had sometimes used when storms forced him to seek shelter. He aimed his boat toward it, each stroke of the oars requiring more effort than the last, until finally the hull scraped against sand and stone. Takeshi climbed out of the boat and immediately collapsed. His legs would not hold him, and he lay on the cold beach, his face pressed against wet pebbles, his body shaking uncontrollably. He tried to stand again, but could not. The exhaustion was overwhelming, pulling him down into darkness, and he did not fight it. If he died here, he thought, at least he had kept his promise. At least he had returned to the world of the living, and could tell the story. The thought was oddly comforting, and he let himself sink into unconsciousness with that comfort wrapped around him like a blanket. He woke to warmth, not the warmth of the sun, but the warmth of fire and human presence. Someone had found him on the beach and had carried him to shelter, had wrapped him in dry blankets and built a fire to drive away the cold. He opened his eyes slowly, his vision blurry, and saw the interior of a small hut. An old woman sat by the fire, stirring something in a pot that smelled of broth and herbs. She noticed his movement and turned to look at him, her weathered face breaking into a smile. She told him he had been found by children playing on the beach, that they had run to the village for help, that the men had carried him back and the women had tended to him. He had been unconscious for 2 days, she said, burning with fever and speaking in his sleep about ships and ghosts and emperors. They had feared he would not wake, but here he was, alive and aware, and that was cause for gratitude. Takeshi tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The woman brought him water, holding the cup to his lips, and he drank gratefully. When he could finally form words, he asked where he was. She named a village he knew, several hours from his own home, and confirmed what he had already guessed. The current had carried him far from his usual territory. He asked about his boat, and she told him it was safe, pulled up above the tide line, his nets and equipment untouched. Over the next several days, as his strength slowly returned, Takeshi stayed with the village and was cared for by people who knew him only as a fellow fisherman who had been caught in bad weather. They did not press him for details about what had happened, accepting his vague explanations of fog and strong currents. But the old woman who had first tended to him seemed to sense there was more to the story. One evening, when the two of them were alone by the fire, She asked him directly what he had seen out there in the strait. And Takeshi, remembering his promise to the monk, told her. He told her everything. About the fog and the ghost ships. About the battle replayed in phantom form. About the warrior Tomomori and the drowned emperor. About the temple that existed between worlds and the monk who had made him promise to remember. He told her about the lights and the faces and the weight of sorrow that permeated that place. About how the Heike could not find peace because they could not let go of their failure. The old woman listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on the fire, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she told him that she had heard such stories before, though never from someone who had actually experienced them. Her grandmother had been a storyteller, she said, one of the biwa hoshi, blind women who traveled the country, reciting the tale of the Heike and other epics. Her grandmother had believed that the stories were true, that the ghosts were real, and that they needed to be remembered. She had dedicated her life to keeping those memories alive, to speaking the names of the dead, to honoring their sacrifice, even though centuries had passed. The old woman looked at Takeshi with eyes that seemed to see past his flesh to the promise he carried inside. "You have been given a gift," she said, "and a burden. The gift is knowledge, the truth of what happened to the Heike. The burden is responsibility, the need to ensure the truth is not lost. Do not take this lightly. Do not convince yourself that it was only a dream or a fever vision. What you experienced was real, and the promise you made must be kept." Takeshi nodded. He had no intention of forgetting or dismissing what had happened. The experience had changed him in ways he was still beginning to understand. He had gone into the fog as a man living half a life, going through the motions of existence without really engaging with it. He had emerged as someone with purpose, with a duty that extended beyond catching fish and surviving each day. He had been entrusted with something precious, and he would honor that trust. When Takeshi was strong enough to travel, the villagers helped him prepare his boat and provided him with supplies for the journey home. The weather had cleared, the fog had not returned, and the sea was calm under a bright autumn sky. He rowed north along the coast, retracing the path the current had taken him, and by late afternoon he reached his own village. News of his return spread quickly. The other fishermen had assumed he was dead, lost to the fog that had kept them in port for nearly a week. They gathered at the shore to greet him, their expressions a mixture of relief and curiosity. They asked questions, wanting to know what had happened, where he had been, how he had survived. But Takeshi found he could not tell them the same story he had told the old woman. These men would not understand. They would think him mad or a liar. So he gave them a simpler version, speaking of fog and strong currents and luck that had kept him from drowning. They accepted his explanation, though some looked skeptical. The eldest among them, a man who had fished the strait for more than 50 years, pulled Takeshi aside and spoke in a low voice. He said he had seen the fog before, many years ago, and had heard things in it that he could not explain. He did not know if the old stories about the Heike were true, but he knew that the strait was not an ordinary place. There were depths there that went beyond water, places where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. If Takeshi had seen something out in that fog, he should not speak of it casually. The dead deserved respect, and some truths were too heavy for ordinary conversation. Takeshi thanked him for the advice and returned to his small house at the edge of the village. Everything was as he had left it. though the air inside was stale and the fire had long since gone cold. He cleaned and relit the hearth, prepared a simple meal, and sat by the fire as night fell outside. But sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw ghost ships and spectral faces, heard the whisper of voices speaking of duty and loss. The promise he had made to the monk weighed on him, and he knew he needed to find a way to keep it. In the days that followed, Takeshi began to change his routine. He still fished, still went out each morning to cast his nets, but he no longer went alone. He started visiting the village temple more frequently, speaking with the priest there about the history of the Heike, about the battle of Dan no Ura, about the souls that were said to wander the strait. The priest was an educated man, familiar with the tale of the Heike and other historical texts, and he was happy to discuss them. Through these conversations, Takeshi learned more about the people he had seen in the fog, putting names and context to the faces that haunted his memory. He learned about Taira no Kiyomori, the powerful leader who had brought the clan to its height, only to die of fever before seeing their fall. About Taira no Munamori, Kiyomori's son, who had lacked his father's brilliance and had been outmaneuvered by the Minamoto general Yoshitsune. About the women of the court who had drowned themselves rather than face capture, and about the child emperor Antoku, who had been both a symbol of divine authority and a pawn in a game he could not understand. Each name was a thread in a larger tapestry, and Takeshi began to see the full picture of what had happened all those centuries ago. But knowledge alone was not enough. The monk had asked him to tell the story, to speak the names, to ensure the Heike were remembered. So Takeshi began to share what he had learned. At first, he spoke only to those who seemed interested, fishermen who asked questions about the strait, travelers who mentioned the old legends. He would tell them about the battle, about the people who had fought and died, about the sorrow that still lingered in that place. Some listened with interest. Others dismissed his words as the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone on the water. But Takeshi did not mind. He was keeping his promise, and that was what mattered. As the weeks passed, word of his stories spread beyond the village. A traveling merchant mentioned them to a sake house owner in a nearby town, who in turn told a scholar visiting from Kyoto. The scholar, intrigued by the idea of a fisherman who claimed to have encountered the ghosts of the Heike, traveled to Takeshi's village to speak with him. Takeshi was wary at first, uncertain if the scholar would believe him or mock him. But the man proved to be genuinely interested, listening carefully to every detail, asking thoughtful questions, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. The scholar told Takeshi that there were others like him, people throughout history who had claimed to encounter the Heike spirits. Some were dismissed as liars or fools. Others were celebrated as mystics or prophets, but all of them shared a common thread. They had been changed by the experience, had felt compelled to tell the story, had understood that the dead were not truly gone as long as they were remembered. The scholar believed Takeshi, he said, because his story had the ring of truth. It was too detailed, too consistent with historical accounts, too respectful of the dead to be mere fabrication. Before the scholar left, he gave Takeshi a gift. It was a small wooden box containing paper, ink, and brushes. He encouraged Takeshi to write down his experience, to record it in his own words so that it would not be lost. Takeshi protested that he was not a writer, that his calligraphy was poor and his education limited. But the scholar insisted that it did not matter. The value was not in perfect writing, but in honest recording. The dead needed witnesses, and witnesses needed to leave their testimony for future generations. So Takeshi began to write. It was slow, frustrating work. His hands were better suited to pulling nets than holding brushes, and the characters he formed were clumsy and awkward. But he persisted, writing a little each evening by firelight, recording everything he remembered about his time in the fog. The ships, the faces, the voices, the battles, the temple, the monk. He wrote about Tomomori and the child emperor, about the women who had jumped and the men who had fought, about the lights that wandered and the sorrow that soaked everything like rain. The work took months. Winter came, and with it storms that kept him from fishing for days at a time. But the forced idleness gave him more time to write, and he made steady progress. By the time spring returned, he had filled dozens of pages with his testimony. The scholar returned to collect the manuscript, and Takeshi handed it over with mixed feelings. It felt strange to give away something so personal, something that had consumed so much of his time and energy. But the scholar promised that he would ensure it was preserved, that it would be copied and studied, that Takeshi's testimony would become part of the historical record. The Heike would be remembered not just as legends, but as real people who had suffered real losses. And that, the scholar said, was the greatest gift one could give to the dead. Years passed. Takeshi continued to fish the strait, though he was more careful now about when and where he ventured. He'd learned to read the signs that preceded the fog, the subtle changes in wind and current that suggested the boundary between worlds was growing thin. On those days, he stayed close to shore, respecting the space the ghosts needed to continue their eternal vigil. He never encountered them again as he had that first time, but he felt their presence often, a sudden chill on a warm day, a whisper carried on wind that came from no direction, the sense of being watched by eyes that existed just beyond the edge of vision. He grew older. His hair turned gray, then white. His back bent from years of pulling nets. His hands became gnarled and scarred. But his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to his promise never wavered. He continued to tell the story of the Heike to anyone who'd listen. And as he aged, people began to seek him out specifically to hear it. He became something of a local legend himself, the fisherman who'd crossed into the realm of the dead and returned. Some believed him completely. Others thought the story was embellished or symbolic, but all agreed that he told it with such conviction and detail that it was impossible to dismiss entirely. The temple priest, who'd become a friend over the years, suggested that Takeshi should visit the actual site where the battle had taken place. There was a shrine there now, built to honor the fallen Heike, where monks performed regular ceremonies to ease the suffering of the dead. Takeshi had resisted the idea at first, uncertain what good it would do. But as he grew older and felt his own death approaching, he decided to make the journey. It was early summer when he traveled south to Dan-no-ura. The weather was clear and warm, the sea calm and inviting. The shrine stood on a hill overlooking the strait, its red torii gate visible from far away. Takeshi climbed the stone steps slowly, his old legs protesting each rise, until he reached the main building. Inside, the air was thick with incense, and the walls were covered with prayer tablets left by visitors, asking for blessings or forgiveness. But what caught Takeshi's attention was a scroll hanging in the place of honor behind the altar. It depicted the Battle of Dan-no-ura, ships clashing in turbulent water, warriors fighting and falling, a small figure in imperial robes standing at the center of the chaos. The artistry was beautiful, but what moved Takeshi wasn't the technical skill. It was the emotion captured in the scene. The artist had understood somehow. the tragedy of what had happened here. This wasn't a glorification of war or a celebration of victory. It was a lament for all that had been lost, for the people who died too young, for the dreams that had sunk beneath the waves. Takeshi knelt before the altar and offered prayers. Not the formal prayers he'd been taught as a child, but prayers from his heart. He spoke the names of those he'd seen in the fog. Tomomori, who'd tied an anchor to his waist. The emperor's grandmother, who'd chosen to die with the child rather than let him be captured. The young Entoku himself, who'd deserved so much better than the fate he received. The women and children who'd followed their men into the depths. The warriors who'd fought with courage even when they knew the battle was lost. He spoke each name carefully, clearly, making sure the gods and spirits heard him, making sure the dead knew they hadn't been forgotten. As he prayed, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't the warmth of fire or sunlight, but something deeper, more profound, a sense of rightness, of completion, of duty fulfilled. He'd kept his promise. He'd remembered. He'd told their story and recorded it for others. He'd honored the dead to the best of his ability. And now, kneeling in this shrine built to their memory, he felt their gratitude wash over him like a wave. When he finally rose and left the shrine, his legs felt stronger than they had in years. The walk down the stone steps was easier than the climb up had been. And when he looked out at the strait, at the blue water sparkling in the sunlight, he could have sworn he saw something moving just beneath the surface. Not threatening, not frightening, just present. A reminder that the Heike were still there, still wandering, but perhaps carrying their burden a little more lightly, now that they knew they were remembered. Takeshi returned to his village and continued his life. He fished less frequently now, his body no longer able to handle the physical demands of the work. But he spent more time at the temple, helping the priest with maintenance and speaking with visitors who came seeking spiritual guidance. He found that his experience with the Heike had given him a perspective on life and death that others found comforting. He could speak with authority about what lay beyond, about how the actions of the living affected the dead, about the importance of memory and honor. Young people from the village began to visit him, asking to hear his story. He told it to them exactly as it had happened, holding nothing back, adding no embellishments. And he always ended the same way, with the same message the monk had given him. Remember, speak their names. Don't let them fade into nothing. Because as long as we remember the dead, they live on in some small way. And that memory, that continuation, is the only immortality any of us can hope for. The seasons turned. Spring became summer. Summer became autumn. Autumn became winter. The cycle repeated year after year, as it always had and always would. But for Takeshi, each cycle brought him closer to his own ending. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his breath came shorter, in the increasing frequency of days when he lacked the strength to rise from his bed. He wasn't afraid. Death held no terror for someone who'd stood among ghosts and heard their stories. If anything, he was curious. Would he see the Heike again on the other side? Would the monk be there, waiting to welcome him? Would his wife and child finally be returned to him after all these years of loneliness? On a cold winter morning, when the frost painted patterns on his windows and his breath misted white in the still air, Takeshi woke, knowing that this would be his last day. There was no pain, no dramatic symptom, just a quiet certainty that his time had run its course. He rose slowly, performed his morning rituals with careful attention, and made his way to the shore. The other fishermen were already out on the water, their boats small dots on the horizon. He stood at the edge of the sand and looked out at the strait that had defined his entire life. The water was gray and restless, stirred by wind that came from the north. The same wind that had brought the fog all those years ago. And as Takeshi watched, he saw it beginning to form. Not thick and overwhelming as it had been during his encounter, but thin and wispy, drifting across the surface like silk scarves. His heart beat faster. They were coming. The Heike were coming to meet him one last time. The fog grew denser, and the ghost ships emerged from it as they had before. The great warships with their tattered banners, the smaller vessels carrying supplies and families, the spectral crews going through their eternal routines. But this time, one of the ships broke formation and turned toward the shore. It glided across the water without sound, without wake, until it reached the shallows where Takeshi stood. And at its rail stood Tomomori, the warrior who'd spoken to him in the fog, who'd shared the burden of his regret and his failure. The ghost looked exactly as he had years ago, unchanged by time, because time no longer touched him. But there was something different in his expression. Not peace. That would be too much to hope for. But perhaps a lessening of the anguish that had defined him. He looked at Takeshi and nodded once, a gesture of recognition and respect. Then he extended his hand, an invitation or an offer. Takeshi understood. This was a choice. He could remain on the shore, could return to his house, and die in his bed surrounded by the familiar comforts of the living world. Or he could step onto that ship, could join the Heike in their endless voyage, could become part of the story he'd dedicated his life to preserving. It should have been a difficult decision. But it wasn't. He'd been alone for so long, had carried the weight of his promise for so many years. The thought of companionship, even the companionship of ghosts, was suddenly deeply appealing. He stepped forward into the shallow water. It was cold, so cold it burned, but he didn't stop. He waded deeper until the water reached his waist, his chest, his shoulders. And then Tomomori's hand closed around his, solid despite being spirit, and pulled him up onto the deck of the ghost ship. Takeshi stood dripping on weathered planks that shouldn't have been able to support his weight, surrounded by warriors who'd been dead for 800 years, and felt more at home than he had in decades. The ship turned and glided back out to sea, rejoining the formation. Takeshi looked back at the shore and saw a small crowd gathering. The fishermen returning from their morning work, the villagers coming down to the beach, all of them staring at the fog and the shapes moving within it. Could they see him? Could they see the ghost ships? Or was this visible only to those who'd been chosen, who'd been given the gift and burden of witnessing? He would never know. The fog closed around the ship and the shore disappeared from view. But Takeshi wasn't afraid. He stood at the rail next to Tomomori and watched as the strait unfolded before them. The other ghost ships sailed in their eternal pattern, their crews performing duties that had lost meaning centuries ago, but continued through force of habit and honor. The lights of the drowned drifted past, their glow casting strange shadows on the water. And somewhere ahead, visible now that he was truly part of this realm, Takeshi could see the temple rising from the sea. The monk still stood in the doorway, still waiting, still offering what comfort he could to the wandering dead. Tomomori spoke, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. He thanked Takeshi for keeping his promise, for remembering them, for ensuring their story wasn't lost. Because of him, the scholar had written a text that was now being studied at universities. Because of him, more people knew the truth of what had happened at Dan no Ura. Because of him, the prayers offered at the shrine carried more weight, more understanding, more genuine sorrow for what had been lost. It wasn't enough to free them from their cycle, but it helped. It eased the burden, and for that, the Heike were grateful. Takeshi asked if they would ever find peace, if the cycle would ever end. Tomomori didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the fog, at the endless gray, at the ships that sailed nowhere. Then he said that perhaps peace wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was the journey itself, the continuation, the act of remembering and being remembered. The living feared death because they saw it as an ending. But death wasn't an ending. It was a transformation, a change from one state to another. The Heike had transformed from warriors into ghosts, from historical figures into legends, from legends into something more personal through the stories people like Takeshi told. They existed in multiple forms simultaneously, and each form served a purpose. As long as people remembered them, they were alive in a way that transcended flesh and blood. As long as their story was told, they mattered. And perhaps that was its own kind of peace, not the cessation of existence, but the continuation of meaning, not forgetting, but being remembered, not silence, but echo. The ship sailed on through the fog, and Takeshi found himself becoming part of its crew. He learned the rhythms of this eternal voyage, the patterns of movement that defined it. He stood watch alongside warriors who died before his ancestors were born. He listened to their stories, learning details that had never been recorded in any text. And he added his own story to theirs, speaking of life in a fishing village, of loss and loneliness and love, of the choices that defined a person and the promises that gave life meaning. In the village, they found Takeshi's body 3 days later. He'd collapsed on the beach, facing the water, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. They carried him to the temple and prepared him for burial according to tradition. The priest who'd been his friend performed the funeral rites, speaking of a man who'd lived simply but meaningfully, who'd honored the dead and kept faith with his promises. The other fishermen attended, paying their respects to one of their own. And when they lowered his body into the ground beneath a tree that overlooked the strait, they swore they saw fog rolling in from the north, thicker than normal for that time of year, as if the sea itself was mourning. The story of Takeshi the fisherman spread. The scholar who'd recorded his testimony published it as part of a larger work on folk beliefs and supernatural encounters. It was read by academics and storytellers, by priests and curious laypeople. Some dismissed it as fantasy. Others believed every word. Most fell somewhere in between, seeing in it a truth that transcended mere facts. Whether or not Takeshi had actually encountered ghosts was less important than what his story represented. The need to remember, the importance of honoring those who came before, the understanding that the past wasn't dead, but lived on in the stories we told and the lessons we carried forward. In the years that followed, more people visited the shrine at Dan no Ura. They came not just to pray, but to listen, to connect with the history that had unfolded there. The monks who maintained the shrine began to incorporate Takeshi's testimony into their teachings, using it as an example of how the living and the dead could communicate across the barrier of mortality. They spoke of him as a bridge, a translator who'd taken the wordless suffering of spirits and given it voice and form. Children in the villages along the strait grew up hearing the story. They learned about the Heike not as distant historical figures, but as real people who'd lived and loved and lost. They learned that ghosts weren't just scary monsters meant to frighten them into obedience, but were echoes of real trauma, real sorrow, real unfulfilled duty. And they learned that memory was a responsibility, something to be tended and maintained, not allowed to fade through neglect. The fishermen who worked the strait developed new traditions. Before setting out each morning, they'd pour a cup of sake into the water and speak the names of the Heike, a small offering to honor the dead who wandered below. When fog rolled in unexpectedly, they didn't curse it, but accepted it with respect, understanding that this was a liminal time when the boundary between worlds grew thin. And when they returned to port, they'd visit the small shrine Takeshi had helped maintain and offer prayers for safe passage and continued remembrance. Some nights, when the moon was dark and the wind carried the smell of salt and iron, people claimed to see lights moving across the water. The anabi, the spirit fires, glowing with their pale green luminescence. Most hurried indoors, not wanting to attract the attention of the wandering dead. But a few, the brave or the curious or the deeply spiritual, would stand at the shore and watch. And they'd swear they could hear voices carried on the wind, not threatening or malicious, but sad and searching, still looking, still wandering, still unable to find what they'd lost. But there was something else too, a new voice among the old ones, a voice that spoke with the accent of a fisherman, that told stories of nets and catches and simple village life, that reminded the warriors of the world they'd left behind, the normal existence that had continued long after their dramatic end. That brought comfort through its very ordinariness, a reminder that not all of life was battle and tragedy, that there had been and continued to be simple joys and quiet moments and the steady rhythm of seasons turning. Takeshi had joined the Heike in their eternal voyage, but he hadn't become lost in their sorrow. He'd brought his own story with him, his own perspective, his own humanity. And in doing so, he'd changed the nature of their haunting. They were still bound to the strait, still unable to move on completely, but they were less alone now. They had a companion who understood both life and death, who could speak of both with equal authority. And that companionship, that understanding, was its own form of salvation. The sea holds everything. It holds the bones of warriors and the tears of widows. It holds the broken ships and the tarnished crowns. It holds the prayers spoken by fishermen at dawn and the curses muttered by soldiers in their final moments. It holds history and legend, truth and myth, memory and forgetting. And it holds the promise that nothing is ever truly lost as long as someone remembers. In the depths below the Shimonoseki Strait, where the currents run cold and strong, there's a realm that exists alongside our own. It's not separate from the world of the living, but overlapping with it, touching it at certain times and places. In that realm, the ghost ships of the Heike continue their eternal patrol. Their crews perform their duties with the precision of long practice. Their banners, faded to the color of dried blood, still fly from masts worn smooth by centuries of phantom wind. And among them, standing at the rail of a great warship, is a fisherman who once lived a quiet life in a small village. He watches the waters he fished for decades, seeing them now from a different perspective. The young fishermen in their boats, heading out before dawn, remind him of who he once was. The families gathering on the shore for festivals remind him of life's continuing cycle. The children playing at the water's edge remind him that the world goes on, that suffering and loss are balanced by joy and new beginnings. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and gray, the two realms draw very close. A fisherman might glance up from his nets and see, just for a moment, the outline of an ancient warship sliding past. A child playing on the beach might hear voices speaking in old-fashioned phrases, telling stories of battles and honor. A monk praying at the shrine might feel a presence nearby, listening to the prayers, drawing comfort from the knowledge that someone still cares. These moments are brief. The fog always lifts eventually, and the clear line between living and dead reasserts itself. But the moments matter. They're proof that the barrier isn't absolute, that connection is possible, that the dead aren't gone, but simply changed. And for those who've been touched by such moments, who've glimpsed the ghost ships, or heard the whispered voices, or felt the presence of something ancient and sorrowful, life is never quite the same again. They carry the knowledge with them, a weight and a gift, a burden and a blessing. The story continues. It's told by monks to pilgrims, by grandparents to grandchildren, by fishermen to sailors. It changes slightly with each telling, gaining new details or losing old ones, but the core remains constant. The Heike fell at Dan no Ura. Their spirits wander still, and a fisherman named Takeshi encountered them, learned their truth, and promised to remember. That promise was kept in life and continues in death. And as long as the story is told, as long as the names are spoken, as long as someone stands at the shore and acknowledges the presence of those who came before, the promise will endure. The sea remembers everything, and in its memory, the past lives on. Not as something dead and gone, but as something that flows beneath the surface, shaping the currents, influencing the tides, making itself known to those who are willing to see. The Heike are there, in the dark water and the rolling fog. Takeshi is there, standing watch beside them, and they'll remain there, year after year, century after century, as long as the sea itself endures. In the temple that overlooked the strait, the priest kept a special scroll. It wasn't the original manuscript Takeshi had written, that had been taken by the scholar to be preserved in a university archive, but a copy made by a calligrapher who'd been moved by the story. The characters were beautiful, flowing across the paper like water, but the content was exact, transcribed word for word from Takeshi's account. The priest would unroll this scroll on certain days, days that held significance in the calendar of the dead. The anniversary of the Battle of Dan no Ura, the day Takeshi had disappeared into the fog, the equinoxes when the balance between light and dark, living and dead, was most delicate. On those days, people would gather at the temple to listen as the priest read Takeshi's words aloud. Young and old, wealthy and poor, believers and skeptics, all came to hear the story. And as the priest's voice carried through the hall, speaking of ghost ships and wandering spirits, and a promise kept across the boundary of death, something shifted in the air. The temperature would drop slightly. The incense smoke would swirl in patterns that matched no draft. And those who were sensitive to such things would feel it, the presence of witnesses. The Heike themselves, drawn by the sound of their names being spoken, by the act of remembrance being performed. The priest would finish reading, and silence would fill the temple. Not an empty silence, but a full one, pregnant with meaning and memory. Then slowly, one by one, the people would speak. they'd share their own encounters with the mysterious and the unexplainable. A grandmother who'd seen lights dancing over the water on the night her husband died. A young man who'd heard voices while fishing alone, voices that warned him of a coming storm. A child who'd dreamed of warriors in ancient armor, warriors who seemed sad but not frightening. These weren't grand visions like Takeshi's. They were small moments, brief touches between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But they mattered. Each one was a thread in the larger tapestry, a connection that kept the past alive in the present. And the priest would record them carefully, adding them to the growing collection of testimonies that documented the continuing presence of the Heike. Years turned to decades. Decades turned to centuries. The village changed. Houses were rebuilt in modern styles. The fishing boats gained motors and electronics. The temple was renovated, its ancient wood replaced with new timber, its roof tiled with modern materials. But the story remained. It was passed down through generations, adapted for new times, but never fundamentally altered. The Heike still wandered. Takeshi had still encountered them. The promise to remember still held power. Scholars came from universities to study the phenomenon. They interviewed the locals, examined the historical records, compared the accounts of different witnesses. Some approached it with skepticism, looking for rational explanations, psychological causes, mass delusion. Others came with more open minds, willing to accept that perhaps there were aspects of reality that science couldn't yet explain. But regardless of their starting assumptions, most left with a sense that something genuine was happening here. Too many people had experienced similar things. Too many details matched across testimonies separated by time and space. Coincidence could only explain so much. A documentary filmmaker came and spent a month in the village, capturing footage of the strait, interviewing descendants of Takeshi, recording the priest reading from the scroll. The film was released to modest attention, playing mostly in art houses and at film festivals, but those who saw it were affected. The director had captured something of the atmosphere of the place, the sense of living alongside history, the understanding that the past wasn't sealed away in books, but was present and active, shaping the lives of those who lived here. A novelist, inspired by Takeshi's story, wrote a book that became a bestseller. It took liberties with the facts, adding romance and adventure, turning Takeshi into a younger, more heroic figure. But at its core, the novel honored the truth of what had happened. It spoke of duty and memory, of the weight the dead carried, and the responsibility the living had to ease that weight through remembrance. Readers around the world were moved by it, and many made pilgrimages to Dan no Ura to visit the shrine and the temple, to stand at the shore where Takeshi had stood, to pay their respects to the Heike. The increased attention brought changes. The village prospered as tourism grew. New businesses opened to serve the visitors. The temple was expanded, a museum added to display artifacts and information about the battle and its aftermath. But the core traditions were maintained. The morning offerings to the sea, the prayers for the dead, the reading of Takeshi's testimony on significant days. The story was commercialized to some degree, turned into souvenirs and guided tours, but the genuine spiritual element persisted beneath the commerce, and the fog still came. Not every day or even every month, but often enough that everyone who lived in the village long enough would experience it. The way it rolled in from the north, thick and gray and cold. The way it distorted sound and distance. The way it made the boundary between the possible and the impossible seem very thin. Most people stayed indoors when the fog came, not from fear, but from respect. This wasn't their time. This was when the dead walked, when the past reasserted itself, when the Heike continued their eternal vigil. But there were always a few who went out into the fog, the deeply spiritual seeking connection with something greater than themselves, the grieving hoping to catch a glimpse of those they'd lost, the curious unable to resist the pull of mystery. And sometimes, very rarely, they'd see something, a shadow that moved like a ship, a light that glowed with no source, a voice that spoke in a language they didn't know but somehow understood. Those who had such experiences were changed by them, as Takeshi had been changed. They returned to their ordinary lives carrying extraordinary knowledge. They knew, beyond doubt or debate, that death wasn't an ending, that the spirits of the dead persisted in some form, that memory and honor held real power, that the stories were true in ways that transcended mere fact. And they became, in their turn, storytellers and witnesses, keeping the cycle alive, ensuring that the promise made so long ago continued to be honored. The world continued to change. Technology advanced. Beliefs shifted. The old ways of thinking about life and death were challenged by new philosophies and scientific understanding. But in the village by the strait, the story of the Heike endured. It endured because it answered a fundamental human need, the need to believe that those we lose aren't simply gone, that their lives continue to matter, that the bonds we form transcend mortality. Parents told their children about the ghost ships, not to frighten them, but to teach them about duty and honor and the importance of remembering. Schools included the story in their curriculum, using it as a way to connect students to local history and broader themes of war, loss, and the human cost of conflict. The temple continued its ceremonies, the priest reading Takeshi's words to new generations who listened with the same mixture of wonder and respect that their ancestors had shown. And out on the water, where the strait ran deep and cold, the fishermen still poured their sake and spoke their prayers before setting out. They did it partly from tradition, because it was what their fathers and grandfathers had done. But they did it also from genuine feeling, from the understanding that they shared these waters with something old and powerful. They were guests here, temporary users of a space that belonged primarily to the dead, and good guests showed respect. There were nights when the sea was especially restless, when the waves rose high and the wind howled, when even the most experienced fishermen felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. On those nights, they'd speak Takeshi's name along with the names of the Heike, acknowledging the fishermen who'd become part of their story. And they felt, though they couldn't have explained how, that he heard them, that somewhere in that realm between life and death, the fisherman stood at the rail of a ghost ship and listened to the prayers of his successors, pleased that his promise was still being kept, that the memory was still being maintained. The sea holds everything. It holds the past and the present, the living and the dead, the forgotten and the remembered. In its depths are stories without end, cycles without conclusion, promises that span centuries. The Heike will wander those depths for as long as the sea exists, searching for what they lost, carrying the weight of their failure and their duty. Takeshi will wander with them, a companion in their eternal voyage, a bridge between their ancient sorrow and the continuing world of the living. And the story will continue to be told, in temples and schools, in books and films, around fires and in whispers. It'll change with each telling, adapting to new times and new audiences, but its heart will remain constant. Remember the dead. Honor their sacrifice. Speak their names. Don't let them fade into nothing, because in remembering, we give them life. In honoring, we give them peace. In speaking, we give them voice. This is the legacy of Takeshi the Fisherman. This is the promise he kept and continues to keep. This is the truth beneath the legend of the ghost ship of the Heike. The dead aren't gone. They're simply waiting, watching, hoping that someone will remember. And as long as someone does, they live on in the eternal memory of the sea. The waves roll against the shore, constant and unchanging. The tide rises and falls, marking the passage of time that means nothing to those who exist outside its flow. The fog comes and goes, revealing and concealing, opening and closing the door between worlds. And in that space between, in that liminal realm where the possible touches the impossible, the story continues, forever repeating, forever changing, forever true. Listen to the waves. Hear the voices they carry. Feel the cold breath of fog on your skin. And remember the Heike who fell at Dan no Ura. Remember Takeshi, who promised to keep their memory alive. Remember that death isn't an ending, but a transformation. Not a silence, but an echo. Not a forgetting, but an eternal presence waiting to be acknowledged. The sea remembers everything, and in its memory, we find our own. The connection to those who came before, the understanding of those who will come after, the recognition that we're all part of a story larger than our individual lives. We're the living, but we carry the dead with us. In our memories, our traditions, our stories, our prayers, they live in us, and through us, they continue to exist. This is the gift Takeshi gave to the Heike. This is the gift the Heike give to us. The knowledge that nothing is ever truly lost. That love and duty transcend death. That the bonds we form echo through eternity. That remembering is itself a form of immortality. So remember, when the fog rolls in thick and gray, remember. When the sea churns restless beneath a dark sky, remember. When you stand at the shore and feel the weight of all that has come before, remember. The Heike are there, in the water and the mist and the whisper of wind. Takeshi is there, standing watch, keeping his promise. And they wait, patient and eternal, for someone to acknowledge them, to speak their names, to honor their story. The sea remembers everything. Will you?